This video is for you if you're a buyer wondering how you lost out on a home when you bid so much over list price, or if you're a seller wondering how to choose between multiple offers. My name is Phil Wells, I'm a real estate agent serving clients in and around Spokane. In this video we're going to take a deep dive into appraisal gap provisions. What are they, why should you care, and how should you use them? So let's get into it. If a transaction involves financing, it will include an appraisal of some sort so the lender can satisfy themselves that the property in question is good collateral for the loan. An appraisal gap occurs when there's a gap between the appraised value and the offer price. In a market as rapidly growing as Spokane, it's not uncommon for an appraisal gap to occur. And to illustrate this, at last count, the median home price here in Spokane was up 20.6% from where it was last year. If an appraisal gap does arise, then suddenly the lender is unable to lend you or your buyer the money they need to close the deal, and the transaction is at risk. A buyer may have the funds to plug that gap, or a seller may agree to meet the buyer halfway in that appraisal gap, or something in between, but it's not guaranteed how that negotiation will go, as every situation is unique. Once a buyer receives a low appraisal notice from the bank, they are contractually obligated to notify the seller of this low appraisal within a few days. And unless an agreement is reached about how to plug that gap, then the onus is on the seller to come down to sell at the appraised value or to walk away from the contract. Appraisals are usually only delivered a few days before closing, and appraisal gaps are often thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars. So this can really derail a lot of people's plans, or cause significant unplanned concessions. So what can you do as a seller to protect yourself against this, and what can you do as a buyer to convince the seller that yours is the right offer to accept? This is where an appraisal gap provision comes into play. Essentially, all an appraisal gap provision is extra money you offer to the seller to cover or substantially cover an appraisal gap should it arise in the future. So why should you care about something that may or may not arise in the future of your real estate transaction? The answer is simple. Because we're in an extremely competitive market. It's as simple as that. Sellers often have the ability to pick between multiple offers. And if you're not including an appraisal gap provision in your offer, then you're not protecting a seller's bottom line. Which means you could bid a house to the moon. You could literally bid $200,000 over asking on a $300,000 home and still lose the property. Let me give you an example. Imagine I list a home for sale, I review the comps with my seller, and I determine that an appraisal is likely to come back around $460,000 to $470,000, so the seller decides to list for $465,000. We receive two offers. One of the offers is at $530,000 with no appraisal gap provision. The other offer is at $492,000 with a $20,000 appraisal gap provision. Which offer do you think I'm likely to advise my client to accept? If you said the offer with the lower price, you're absolutely right. The reason is that it doesn't matter what price you sign around at, it matters what price you get to the closing table at. It's the same principle as the classic business mantra, revenue is vanity and profit is sanity. In the case of the two offers in my example, imagine the appraisal comes back at $475,000, so $10,000 over the list price. The buyer with the appraisal gap provision has already offered to plug the gap up to $20,000. In this case, there's a $17,000 gap between $475,000 and $492,000. This appraisal gap is plugged by the appraisal gap provision, and the transaction moves to close at $492,000 and everyone's happy. In the case of the offer at $530,000 without an appraisal gap provision, suddenly there's a $55,000 appraisal gap to negotiate. And once notice of that low appraisal is given to the seller, which is contractually obligated to be given, then the onus is on the seller to sell at the appraised value or to walk away from the contract. If you're a buyer, you might be saying, well, hold on, I might offer to plug that gap if it arises, but I want to know if there's going to be an appraisal gap. Well, if that's the case, you should signal that to the seller up front so they know that your offer is solid. In a market with several offers on the table, why would you keep that ace up your sleeve? So Phil, you've made a good point. I understand that appraisal gap provisions are a good idea and that I should probably use them to strengthen my offer. So what's the magic percentage or dollar amount that I should be using for an appraisal gap provision? Well, it really doesn't work like that. There's no good rule of thumb. In practice, the more you put down, the better. Ideally, you should put an amount equal to the amount you bid over list price down, but I understand that can get really expensive really quickly, so I would just say do what you can, and the more you put down, the better. Remember too that an appraisal gap provision may not always cover the appraisal gap. You may have to notify them that the value of the appraised value plus the appraisal gap is still lower than the offer price. So the more of an appraisal gap provision you can put down, the more you shore up what the seller will receive at the closing table, which makes them more likely to accept your offer. Don't be tempted though to look at the comps and determine that an appraisal gap provision is not necessary because you think the property will appraise for what you offer on it. If you include an appraisal gap provision and it's not needed, then that money doesn't disappear, it just stays in your pocket. In a competitive market like we're in right now, likelihood is your competition is including an appraisal gap provision, and after all, it's about winning the offer. Just one note on appraisal gap provisions. For some reason, the state of Washington calls these additional down payments, even though it has nothing to do with the amount of down payment your lender requires. It's just an emergency provision that you offer to the seller to plug an appraisal gap should it arise. Just be aware that it's got an unhelpful name, but its function is an appraisal gap provision. That's it for this video. Appraisal gaps arise because of simple math. Appraisal gap provisions put the seller's mind at ease, knowing that the buyer has promised funds that will be unlocked should an appraisal gap arise in order to cover or substantially cover the gap. In this frenzied market full of well-qualified people and cash buyers, you should absolutely care about appraisal gap provisions and you should absolutely be using them. If you're looking at buying or selling in Spokane, then reach out to me. Give me a call, shoot me a text, send me an email, and I'd be honored to work with you. Until the next one, my name's Phil Wells, and thank you for watching.